Introduction to Anti-Nicene Christian Library, translations of the writings of the Fathers down to A.D. 325. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anti-Nicene Christian Library, translations of the writings of the Fathers down to A.D. 325. By Alexander Roberts, editor. Introduction. Our aim in these translations has been to give a rendering of the original as literal as possible, and to this we have adhered even in cases, and they are not a few, in which the Latin or the Greek is not in strict accordance with grammatical rule. It was thought advisable in all cases to give the reader the means of forming an accurate estimate of the style as well as the substance of these curious documents. The Apocryphal Gospels, properly so called, consist of 22 separate documents, of which 10 are written in Greek and 12 in Latin. These 22 may be classed under 3 heads. A. Those relating to the history of Joseph and the Virgin Mary, previous to the birth of Christ. B. Those relating to the infancy of the Savior, and C. Those relating to the history of Pilate. The origins of the traditions are the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Acts of Pilate. All or most of the others can be referred to these 3 as compilations, modifications, or amplifications. There is abundant evidence of the existence of many of these traditions in the 2nd century, though it cannot be made out that any of the books were then in existence in their present form. The greater number of the authorities on the subject, however, seem to agree in assigning to the first 4 centuries of the Christian era the following 5 books: 1. The Proto-Evangelium of James; 2. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew; 3. The history of Joseph the Carpenter; 4. The Gospel of Thomas; and 5. The Gospel of Nicodemus. We proceed to give a very brief notice of each of them. The Proto-Evangelium of James. The name of Proto-Evangelium was first given to it by Postel, whose Latin version was published in 1552. The James is usually referred to St. James the Less, the Lord's brother, but the titles vary very much. Origen, in the end of the 2nd century, mentions a book of James, but it is by no means clear that he refers to the book in question. Justin Martyr, in 2 passages, refers to the cave in which Christ was born, and from the end of the 4th century down, there are numerous allusions in ecclesiastical writings to statements made in the Proto-Evangelium. For his edition, Tischendorf made use of 17 manuscripts, one of them belonging to the 9th century. The Greek is good of the kind and free from errors and corruptions. There are translations of it into English by Jones, 1722, and Cooper, 1867. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. The majority of the manuscripts attribute this book to Matthew, though the titles vary much. The letters prefixed, professing to be written to and by St. Jerome, exist in several of the manuscripts, but no one who is acquainted with the style of Jerome's letters will think this one authentic. There are, however, in his works many allusions to some of the legends mentioned in this book. Chapters 1 through 24 were edited by Thilo. Chapters 25 to the end are edited for the first time by Tischendorf. It is not very clear whether the Latin be original or a direct translation from the Greek. In most part it seems to be original. The list of epithets, however, applied to the triangles of the Alpha in chapter 31 are pretty obviously mistranslations of Greek technical terms, which it might not be difficult to reproduce. Gospel of the Nativity of Mary. This work, which is in substance the same as the earlier part of the preceding, yet differs from it in several important points, indicating a later date and a different author. It has acquired great celebrity from having been transferred almost entire to the Historia Lombardica, or Legenda Aurore, in the end of the 13th century. Medieval poetry and sacred art have been much indebted to its pages. The original is in Latin, and is not a direct translation from the Greek. In many passages it follows very closely the Vulgate translation. The history of Joseph the Carpenter. The original language of this history is Coptic. From the Coptic it was translated into Arabic. The Arabic was published by Wallen in 1722, with a Latin translation and copious notes. Wallen's version has been republished by Fabricius, and later in somewhat amended form by Thilo. This amended form of Wallen's version is the text adopted by Tischendorf. Chapters 14 through 23 have been published in the Sahidic text by Zoega in 1810, with a Latin translation, and more correctly by Delorier in 1835, with a French translation. Tischendorf employs various arguments in support of his opinion that the work belongs to the 4th century. It is found, he said, in both dialects of the Coptic. The eschatology of it is not inconsistent with an early date. The Feast of the 1,000 Years of chapter 26 had become part of heretical opinion after the 3rd century. The death of the Virgin Mary in chapter 5 is inconsistent with the doctrine of the Assumption, which began to prevail in the 5th century. The Gospel of Thomas. Like the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Gospel of Thomas is of undoubted antiquity. It is mentioned by name by Origen, quoted by Irenaeus, and the author of the Philosoph Humana, who says that it was used by the Nicene, a Gnostic sect of the 2nd century. Cyril of Jerusalem, who passed in 386, attributes the authorship not to the apostle, but to a Thomas who was one of the 3 disciples of Manes. This fact, of course, indicates that Cyril knew nothing of the antiquity of the book he was speaking of. This Manichaean origin has been adopted by many writers, of whom the best known are in recent times R. Simon and Mingarelli. The text of the first Greek form is obtained from a Bologna manuscript published by Mingarelli, with a Latin translation in 1764. A Dresden manuscript of the 16th century edited by Thilo, a Viennese fragment edited by Lambesius, and a Parisian fragment first brought to light by Cotelaire in his edition of the Apostolical Constitutions, and translated into English by Jones. The second Greek form is published for the first time by Tischendorf, who got the manuscript, which is on paper, of the 14th or 15th century from one of the monasteries on Mount Sinai. The Latin form is also published for the first time from a Vatican manuscript. There is another Latin text existing in a palimpsest, which Tischendorf assigns to the 5th century, and asserts to be much nearer the ancient Greek copy than any of the other manuscripts. It seems pretty clear from the contents of the book that its author was a Gnostic, a Doetist, and a Marcosian, and it was held in estimation by the Nicene and the Manichaeans. Its bearing upon Christian art and to some extent Christian dogma is well known. The Greek of the original is by no means good, and the Latin translator has in many cases mistaken the meaning of common Greek words. Arabic Gospel of the Saviour's Infancy. Chapters 1 through 9 are found on the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, and on the Proto-Evangelium of James. Chapters 36 to the end are compiled from the Gospel of Thomas. The rest of the book, chapters 10 through 35, is thoroughly Oriental in its character, reminding one of the tales of the Arabian Nights, or in the episodes in the Golden Ass of Apuleius. It is evident that the work is a compilation and that the compiler was an Oriental. Various arguments are adduced to prove that the original language of it was Syriac. It was first published with a Latin translation and copious notes by Professor Syke of Cambridge in 1697, afterwards by Fabricius, Jones, Schmidt, and Thilo. Tischendorf's text is Sykes' Latin version, amended by Fleischer. There are not sufficient data for fixing with any accuracy the time at which it was composed or compiled. The Gospel of Nicodemus. The 6 documents inserted under this name are various forms of 2 books, 2 in Greek and 1 in Latin of the Acts of Pilate, 1 in Greek and 2 in Latin of the Descent of Christ to the world below. Of 12 manuscripts, only 2 or 3 give the second part consecutively with the first, nor does it so appear in the Coptic translation. The title of Gospel of Nicodemus does not appear before the 13th century. Justin Martyr mentions a book called the Acts of Pilate, and Eusebius informs us that the Emperor Maximin allowed or ordered a book composed by the pagans under this title to be published in a certain portion of the empire, and even to be taught in the schools, but neither of these could have been the work under consideration. Tischendorf attributes it to the 2nd century, which is probably too early, though without doubt the legend was formed by the end of the 2nd century. Maury places it in the beginning of the 5th century, from 405 to 420, and Renan concurs in this opinion. An able writer in the Quarterly Review, volume 116, assigns it to 439. The author of the article Pilate in Smith's Bible Dictionary gives the end of the 3rd century as the probable date. The author was probably a Hellenistic Jew converted to Christianity, or, as Tischendorf and Maury conclude, a Christian imbued with Judaic and Gnostic beliefs. The original language was most probably Greek, though, as in the case of Pseudo-Matthew, the history of Joseph the Carpenter, etc., the original language is, in many of the prefaces, stated to have been Hebrew. Some think that Latin was the original language, on the ground that Pilate would make his report to the emperor, and that the official language. The Latin text we have, however, is obviously a translation, made moreover by a man to whom Greek was not very familiar, as is obvious from several instances specified in our notes to the text. The editio princeps of the Latin text is without place or date, and it has been re-edited by Jones, Birch, Fabricius, Thilo, and others. The Greek text of Part 1 and of a portion of Part 2 was first published by Birch, and afterwards in a much improved form, with the addition of copious notes and prolegomena by Thilo. The latter part of this prolegomena contains a full account of the English, French, Italian, and German translations. For his edition, Tischendorf consulted 39 ancient documents, of which a full account is given in his prolegomena. For an interesting account of these documents, see the introduction to Mr. B. H. Cooper's translation of the Apocryphal Gospels. The letter of Pontius Pilate. The text is formed from 4 authorities, none of them ancient. The report of Pilate. The first of these documents was first published by Fabricius with a Latin translation, the second by Birch, and then by Thilo. Tischendorf has made use of 5 manuscripts, the earliest of the 12th century. It does not seem possible to assign a date. The paradosis of Pilate. It has been well remarked by the author of the article in the Quarterly Review above referred to, that the early church looked on Pilate with no unfavorable eye, that he is favorably shown in the catacombs, that the early fathers interpreted him as a figure of the early church, and held him to be guiltless of Christ's death, that the creeds do not condemn him, and the Coptic Church has even made him a saint. He remarks also that Dante finds punishments for Caiaphas and Annas, but not for Pilate. The text was first edited by Birch and afterwards by Thilo. Tischendorf makes use of 5 manuscripts, of which the earliest belongs to the 12th century. The death of Pilate. This is published for the first time by Tischendorf, from a Latin manuscript of the 14th century. The language shows it to be of a late date. It appears almost entire in the Legenda Aurea. The Narratus of Joseph. This history seems to have been popular in the Middle Ages, if we judge from the number of the Greek manuscripts of it which remain. It was first published by Birch, and after him by Thilo. For his edition, Tischendorf made use of 3 manuscripts, of which the oldest belongs to the 12th century. And finally, the Avenging of the Saviour. This version of the legend of Veronica is written in very barbarous Latin, probably of the 7th or 8th century. An Anglo-Saxon version, which Tischendorf concludes to be derived from the Latin, was edited and translated for the Cambridge Antiquarian Society by C.W. Goodwin in 1851. The Anglo-Saxon text is from a manuscript in the Cambridge Library, one of a number presented to the Cathedral of Exeter by Bishop Leofric in the beginning of the 11th century. The reader will observe that there are in this document 2 distinct legends, somewhat clumsily joined together, that of Nathan's embassy and that of Veronica. End of introduction.